Welcome tonight. We will drift together into a quiet corner of history, far from the royal courts and famous battles, far from the grand cathedrals and glittering banquets. Instead, we will walk slowly, carefully, through a side alley. The light is dim, the shutters are mostly closed, but behind one of these doors, the candles burn low, a soft melody echoes from a worn lute, and you are here to listen, not to judge. This is not a tale of romance or scandal. This is a tale of labor, of repetition, of quiet survival. We will step behind the curtains of the historical European brothel, not to sensationalize, but to understand. We will not dwell on violence or shame, but rather on the daily rhythm of lives lived in shadowed corners of society. Lives shaped by routine, restraint, and a need to endure. Tonight's journey will be gentle, softly told, rich in texture, but never harsh. Our path will take us through four distinct chapters. First, the life of a young woman working in a 14th century brothel, how her days began and how they ended, what she wore, what she smelled, what she feared, and what she hoped for, if anything. Then we will float forward in time to Venice in the 1500s, where we'll meet Veronica Franco, a courtesan, a poet, and a woman who dared to live on the margins of power. In our third segment, we will explore the archaeology and forgotten markers of European brothel symbols carved into stone, doors painted with silent codes, and whispers frozen in frescoes. Finally, we will look upward to those who entered these spaces from palaces and pulpits, nobles and clergy alike, and what their presence meant in this carefully hidden world. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift like candle smoke through the rafters. There's no need to keep your eyes open, no need to remember every word, only to listen. Now let us begin with the day-to-day life of a girl who finds herself in the heart of a medieval brothel, not as a visitor, but as a worker. The morning doesn't so much begin as it slowly replaces the night. It seeps in first as a pale gray in the corners of the room, then as a hush that stirs the rafters and wakes the mice. There is no dramatic sunrise, no joyous birdsong to welcome the day, only the soft creak of aging wood as the house shifts in the morning chill, and the dull ache that settles into your limbs as you stir from a sleep that was never quite deep. You are not alone. 5 of you share this small attic space. It isn't cold enough for frost to form inside, not yet, but the stones beneath your bed are cool to the touch, and the blanket you've pulled over your shoulders is little protection from the damp that curls into your bones. It smells faintly of wool, lavender, and something older, something harder to name, a mixture of sweat and wax and faint, fading perfume. Imagine, you are young, perhaps 16, perhaps 17. Not that age matters much now. You came to this city only months ago, or maybe it's been a year. Time here folds in on itself, measured not in seasons, but in footsteps up creaking stairs and the number of candles burned down. In the hallway, they call this place a red house, though its shutters are pale and the paint has long faded from the door. It is not grand, nor squalid. It sits among others just like it on a narrow street that hums with activity by day and drinks itself to sleep each night. The house is tall, thin, and weary, like its residents. You do not remember how you arrived exactly, not the cart or the gate or the first words you heard upon crossing the threshold. You remember the feel of your shoes too thin, already damp, and the sound of your own breath as you stepped into the hallway. You remember the floor was swept. That surprised you. You remember the voice of the mistress, slow, firm, not unkind. She spoke to you directly, asked if you had eaten, handed you a basin and a cloth, told you to clean up. That's all. Your life before this place was filled with rough textures, hay, wind, wool skirts, and muddy pots. Life in the village was hard, but simple, predictable. You rose with the animals, ate what was there, prayed because others did. Now, you rise with the sound of footsteps on the floor below, or with the faint crack of the stove as it's relit. This morning, like others, begins not with a rush but a sequence. You sit up, stretching your arms slowly, quietly, trying not to wake the others. You roll your neck, comb your fingers through your hair. You wrap your shawl around your shoulders and make your way carefully down the steep stairs, hand grazing the wall for balance. In the washroom, water waits in a ceramic bowl, not warm, but not frozen. It stings a little on contact, but you are used to it. You splash it on your face, then your arms. You dab beneath your eyes with a linen cloth. The mirror beside the basin is warped and pitted with age. You see your reflection, but only just a version of yourself that flickers and fades in the dim morning light. Downstairs, the hearth is lit. The smell of last night's fire still lingers in the air, joined now by the dry scent of charcoal and the metallic tang of the cooking pot. There is bread stale but edible and watered wine in clay cups. You take one. You do not speak. The other girls do not, either. Not yet. Words will come later. When the day has shaped itself, the mistress moves among you, her shoes tapping gently, her sleeves tied back. She does not raise her voice. She doesn't need to. She checks the ledgers, the bedding, the storeroom, the candles. She is methodical. Order is her armor, her means of survival in a world that watches but does not forgive. You understand that now. Your first task is to sweep. You take the broom and begin in the hallway, working your way inward. The floor is stone, worn smooth in the middle by years of footsteps. Dust collects in the corners. You move carefully, rhythmically, listening to the scratch of straw on stone and the distant clatter of hooves outside. It is comforting, in a way, the repetition, the way the same path is always cleaned, the same order maintained. After sweeping, you collect the linens. They are taken down to the courtyard where a small tub waits filled with gray water and slivers of soap that cling to your hands like old wax. You scrub slowly, not because you are lazy, but because speed invites mistakes. You scrub and rinse, then hang the cloths on a rope between two beams, watching as they drip quietly into the dirt below. By mid-morning, the light has changed. It slants in through the back window, catching the motes in the air and turning them golden. This is your favorite time of day, not because it is peaceful, but because it is predictable. The house is still. The city beyond its walls is just beginning to stir. Merchants call out their wares. A bell rings in the distance. You pause by the window and let the sunlight warm your hands. Inside, the rooms are being prepared. You help with this, too. Each one is small, barely large enough for a bed and a table. But they are neat. There is order in their simplicity. You change the sheets, fluff the pillows, light the candles in their holders. You fold the towels at the end of each bed and place a sprig of rosemary beside them, not because it changes anything, but because it makes the room feel less empty. There are smells here, not unpleasant, just layered wax wood wine, old perfume that has seeped into the walls. You move through them like drifting through memory. Nothing is strong, everything is soft, dim. You open a window briefly to air the space, and the cold rushes in like a question. You close it again. In the afternoon, there are errands. You walk with one of the older girls to fetch herbs from the apothecary, a small, cluttered shop filled with glass jars and drying bundles. The apothecary is kind, but brisk. He does not ask questions. He gives you the usual mix: lavender, thyme, a bit of camphor. You carry it back wrapped in a cloth, the scent rising around you like a shield. You stop at the baker, too. A crust of yesterday's loaf, a few onions. You do not linger. The streets are noisy, and though no one shouts at you, you feel their eyes. Some glance quickly away, others do not. Back at the house, the mood has shifted again. The rooms are ready, the candles trimmed, the curtains drawn. You help light the sconces on the walls, one by one, always in the same order. Before supper, there is time to rest. You sit in the kitchen with a cup of broth. It is thin, but warm. You tuck your feet beneath you and rest your cheek against the back of the chair. The fire crackles gently in the hearth. Someone hums a song you almost remember. You do not speak. You do not need to. The house breathes with you. Soon, the evening will begin. But for now, you are still. And in that stillness, in the slow breath of the house, there is a kind of peace, a rhythm, a pattern, not chosen, but familiar. And familiarity, you have learned, is a kind of safety. You close your eyes. Evening does not arrive all at once. It unfolds quietly, like a shawl drawn slowly over the shoulders of the city. The golden light that once spilled across the cobblestones fades to amber, then to smoke. Shadows grow longer, and lanterns flicker into being, one by one, marking the end of another day and the beginning of the night's labor. Within the red house, the air thickens slightly, not with tension, exactly, but with expectation. You can feel it in the way the rooms begin to settle, the hush that falls across the kitchen, the way footsteps become quieter, more measured. Somewhere down the street, a man laughs too loudly. A door slams, then silence again. You make your way to the upper room where you prepare. The looking glass here is cracked, but you've learned how to see past the break. You pull your shift tight around your waist and reach for the rouge. It comes in a small wooden pot, shared among the girls. You use your finger to dab a touch of color onto your cheeks, then the lips. You smooth your hair with a comb made from horn. There is a bottle of rose water on the table, half empty, but fragrant. You sprinkle just a little at your neck and wrists. The scent lingers in the air, soft and familiar. There is a ritual to this, one you know by heart. Every movement has its place. Every item its purpose, not for vanity, but for preparation, for armor. You do not know who will walk through the door tonight, but you will be ready. Downstairs, the mistress checks the ledgers. She lights the hallway lamps. The candles in each room are trimmed, their wicks pinched to avoid excess smoke. Clean linens are laid out. A basin of warm water is placed near the hearth. Everything is quiet, deliberate. This is not a place of chaos. It cannot afford to be. Then, the knock, always soft, always uncertain. The first man is middle-aged, cloaked in a wool coat damp from the evening fog. He steps inside with a hesitance that suggests this is not his first visit, but not his 100th either. He nods to the mistress and hands over a coin. She makes a note in the ledger and gestures toward you. You meet him in the parlor, a narrow room with low ceilings and worn cushions. There is wine, diluted with water, in a carafe on the table. You pour a cup, offer it gently. He accepts it without speaking. You smile, but not too broadly. There is a balance to be struck: warmth, but not familiarity, comfort, but not attachment. You ask his name. He gives one, but you suspect it is not real. It doesn't matter. Names are only as true as the moment requires. You sit across from him and let the silence stretch, just long enough to be restful. Eventually, he speaks about his journey, his work, his wife, his loneliness, or perhaps he says nothing at all. You nod, you listen. That, more than anything, is what he has paid for. The sense of being seen, if only for a moment. Even if it is a lie, it is a quiet lie, and quiet lies are often the easiest to fall asleep beside. When he stands, you lead him upstairs. The boards creak beneath your feet, but you know which to avoid. The room is already prepared, candles lit, bed turned down. The window is cracked just enough to let in air, but not the noise. He removes his boots. You remove your shoes, and for a short time, the house is no longer a workplace, but a place of repetition. Like sweeping, like cooking, like washing, you learn not to focus too much, not to dwell in the moment, but to float above it. You watch the candle flicker on the wall. You count your breaths. You hum softly in your mind, a tune from your childhood that loops and loops without end. When he leaves, he does not say goodbye. Few do. You wash yourself in the basin, redress, and pour another cup of wine. You do not drink it. It is a part of the ritual, a return to the beginning. The second man is younger, more nervous. His hands shake slightly as he offers the coin. He apologizes for his clothes, his smell, his voice. You tell him he need not. You tell him gently. He smiles, but only with his eyes. You guide him in, and the cycle begins again. Hours pass this way, not quickly, not slowly, just continuously. Time becomes less a line and more a pool. You dip your hands into it and withdraw them, over and over. Between visits, there are small moments. You sit in the kitchen, by the fire, sharing a crust of bread or a piece of dried fruit. One of the other girls braids your hair, another mends her shift. By candlelight, you speak softly, if at all. Words are a precious thing after so much listening. Sometimes, you simply lean your head against the warm stone of the hearth and let your mind drift. Upstairs, the rooms are cleaned between each guest. The linens are folded, the pillows fluffed, the candles replaced if they've burned too low. The scent of lavender is reapplied at the corners of the beds, not for the clients, but for yourselves, to remember that the space is yours, too. At times, you are called upon not for your body, but for your voice. A man who has lost someone asks to hear a song. Another wishes only to speak of his childhood, of rivers and apple trees and brothers long gone. You listen. You nod. You become, for a short while, someone he can remember, someone who will vanish before morning. There is comfort in that, in being temporary. Outside, the city continues its slow exhale. The streets grow quieter, the taverns dim. Even the wind seems to hush itself as midnight approaches. You glance at the clock in the hallway, its hands worn from years of turning. You do not count the hours, only the candles burned. Sometimes, late at night, you slip away for a moment, up to the attic, or out into the courtyard. You tilt your face toward the sky. If the clouds are kind, you can see stars. If not, the darkness is enough. You draw your shawl tighter and breathe deeply. The air smells of smoke, of stone, of rosemary and ash. It is not beautiful, but it is still, and stillness is a gift. When the final guest departs, you do not collapse into sleep, not yet. There are chores to be done, floors to be swept, water to be brought in, bread to be soaked. You move through them as if in a dream. Your hands know the path, your feet follow it. Eventually, the candles are snuffed, one by one, the curtains drawn, the doors bolted. The house exhales with you. You climb the stairs slowly, each step a familiar note in a lullaby. In the attic, the others are already curled beneath their blankets. You slip between the sheets, the fabric cool against your skin. Your breath slows, your eyes close. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. But for now, in the softness of this moment, you let yourself rest. The rhythm of the house continues without you, and in that rhythm, you are safe. There is something about the morning light that changes depending on what kind of day it will be. On most mornings, it slips through the shutters like a sigh, slow, quiet, and indifferent. But on certain days, it seems sharper, less forgiving, a colder hue that settles over the floorboards like frost. Today is one of those days. The house moves more quickly this morning. There is no urgent panic, there never is, but the silence has a certain density to it. You can feel it pressing in as you wake, even before the others begin to stir. There is a rustle of skirts, a muffled cough, and the quick, rhythmic brushing of hair. No one speaks, but everyone knows. Today is inspection day. Twice a week, every week, the women of the Red House are required to walk through the city to the designated bathhouse. It is a condition of operation, an agreement between the city authorities and the brothel mistress. A measure, they say, of health, of hygiene, of control. You do not resent it, exactly. You understand its purpose. But that understanding does not make the process any more pleasant. You rise, wash your face, and dress in plain linen, nothing too fine, nothing stained or torn. The mistress is strict about appearances. You are not permitted to wear rouge on inspection days, no scent, either, nothing that might confuse the examiner. You pull your shawl over your shoulders and wait by the door. The walk to the bathhouse is short but conspicuous. You move in pairs, heads down, steps measured. The streets are not as crowded in the early morning, but those who are out, the fishmongers, the baker's boys, the laundry women, know where you are headed. Some avoid eye contact, others stare. You've learned to keep your gaze on the ground, not in shame, but in preservation. The bathhouse itself is a squat stone building tucked behind the guild quarter. It is older than the brothel and smells of wet stone and boiled herbs. The steam clings to the walls. Inside, there is a waiting area lined with benches and a narrow corridor that leads to the back chambers. You sit and wait your turn. The other women speak quietly among themselves. Nothing of importance, whether supper, the new girl with the lisp. You let their voices drift past you like water. You focus on your breathing, slow, measured. Eventually, your name is called. You rise and follow the attendant, a woman older than the rest, with a lined face and sharp eyes. She carries a slate and a piece of chalk. She does not smile. In the examination room, you are asked to disrobe behind a curtain. There is no privacy beyond that. You emerge, and the inspector, usually a city-appointed physician or an apprentice, watches as you are looked over. They do not speak unless necessary. They note your skin, your breath, the whites of your eyes. They ask if you've felt fevered, if you've had pain. You answer plainly. They do not touch unless required, and when they do, it is with gloved hands, cold, precise. Once finished, they murmur something to the attendant. She nods, scribbles on the slate, and gestures for you to dress. This time, you are cleared. You dress slowly, listening to the muffled footsteps beyond the curtain. Relief comes not as joy, but as a soft exhale. You have passed. You may return to the house, but not everyone does. Sometimes, a girl is told to remain. Her name is not called again. Later, the mistress will visit the hospice to check on her, but visits are not frequent, and returns are rare. The hospice is not a place of healing so much as a place of waiting. Once there, the rhythm of life you've come to know changes, slows, ends. Illness is a constant companion in the Red House, not always visible, but always present. It hides in the corners of shared rooms, in the water basin, in the unwashed hands of men who forget their names. Sometimes, it arrives without warning, a fever that will not break, a sore that will not heal, a weariness that sinks too deeply to rise from. There are no real treatments, only tinctures, herbs, rituals passed from one woman to another. Dried yarrow for cramping, cloves for breath, vinegar for the skin. Nothing is certain, but the effort is soothing, a kind of control in a life where little else is. You learn to watch for signs not just in yourself, but in the others. A pallor in the cheek, a change in gait, a cough that lasts too long. The mistress, too, watches, not cruelly, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. She cannot afford to let sickness linger. Beyond illness, there is the law. The Red House, like many others, operates under the city's rules, regulations that are both protective and punitive. You are allowed to work, but only within the designated district. You may not leave it after dusk. You may not enter certain establishments. You may not wear particular colors or materials. Silk is forbidden. So is crimson. These are reserved for respectable women. You must attend church once a month but only at designated hours, and always veiled. You must pay tax collected weekly and recorded in the city's registry. Failure to pay results in fines, or worse. The city profits from your labor, even as it pretends not to acknowledge your presence. There are patrols men appointed by the magistrate who ensure that houses like yours remain within the bounds of order. They do not visit often, but when they do, it is unannounced. They check the ledgers, the number of women, the cleanliness of the rooms. They do not look at you unless they must. Fines are issued for infractions. Speaking too loudly from the balcony, wearing jewelry outside, allowing a guest to remain past curfew. The mistress pays them quietly, without argument. She knows better than to complain. And still, the work continues. You learn to move within the boundaries, to keep your head down, to speak when spoken to smile just enough. The rules are not fair, but they are clear, and clarity, like routine, is a form of safety. There are moments, rare but real, when you wonder about what lies beyond the law, beyond illness, beyond the red house. You imagine walking freely through the market, unmasked, unnoticed. You imagine owning something, a room, a dress, a name that belongs only to you. But then, the candle sputters, a knock sounds at the door, and the rhythm begins again. You return to your work, not out of joy, but out of necessity. You return to the others, your companions, in silence, in labor, in laughter when it comes. You light the candles. You straighten the bedding. You draw the curtains just so. You do what must be done, and in doing so, you endure. Venice does not wake with haste. It stirs. The city moves slowly like the water beneath its gondolas, like the fog that curls along its narrow alleys before dawn. You do not hear the roar of horses or the clatter of carts on stone streets. Instead, you hear the sound of water lapping gently against wooden foundations, and the occasional splash of oars dipping rhythmically through the canals. The air is thick with salt and the soft scent of mildew rising from the bricks. And somewhere, perhaps on the far side of the Grand Canal, a baker turns his first loaf of the day, his oven sighing into the stillness. This is the world into which Veronica Franco was born, not into grandeur, not into poverty, but into Venice itself, a city that shimmered somewhere between wealth and ruin, decadence and decay, a city that was, in many ways, its own contradiction. The year was likely 1546, give or take. The Republic of Venice was at the height of its strange and shining power. Its fingers stretched into every corner of the Mediterranean. Its ships carried silk, spice, silver, and secrets, and its streets, narrow and glistening with water, were home to those who built that wealth: merchants, scholars, thieves, nuns, traders, soldiers, and women like Paola Franco. Paola was a courtesana once, an honest courtesan. That term may sound strange to modern ears, but in Venice the word carried weight. It meant a woman not only of beauty, but of learning. She entertained men not just with her body, but with her conversation, her wit, and her verse. It was a role tolerated, sometimes even respected within Venetian society, so long as it remained useful, lucrative, and discreet. To be born the daughter of a courtesan was to live close to power, but never within it. It was to watch carefully, to notice the scent of wine in men's words, the weight of rings on fingers, the way laughter could mean safety or danger depending on who heard it. Veronica would have spent her childhood listening, not always speaking, but listening. She would have heard her mother hosting scholars and nobles in the modest but finely arranged home they kept in the district of San Paolo. She would have sat near the door, a book on her lap, half forgotten, while men in fine boots spoke of art and politics over glasses of clove-scented wine. She would have memorized how her mother paused before answering a question, how she placed her hands when she laughed, how she gently turned an insult into a compliment, and a compliment into a challenge. The home was not rich, but it was cultured. Books lined the shelves, not just romances or religious texts, but poetry, philosophy, letters written by men centuries dead and copied carefully by candlelight. Venice allowed for such things. This strange republic, which crowned no king and paid no pope, had a way of bending the rules of power, just enough to allow people like Paola and her daughter to exist in that narrow space between approval and exile. Veronica's formal education began early. Her mother, perhaps understanding the dangerous gift of intelligence in a girl, ranged for tutors. Latin, Greek, music, rhetoric. These were not idle accomplishments. They were survival. And education was not only a mark of sophistication, it was a means of control. If you could speak well, you could guide a conversation. If you could quote Cicero, you could make a bishop pause. If you could read between the lines of a letter, you might learn what was not being said. Veronica read deeply, and more than that she remembered. She absorbed ideas like cloth takes on perfume. Her mind, by the time she reached her teenage years, was filled with verse and wit, with questions and ambition. She was not content to fade into the background, but the world had already begun to write a role for her. At 15, she was married to a doctor, a man of some standing. Perhaps it was thought she would settle, that she would become what women were supposed to become, a wife, a mother, a quiet keeper of the household. But something in her resisted. The marriage was short. It ended not in tragedy, but in return. She returned home to her mother, to the books, to the conversations, and eventually, to the profession that had shaped her early life. Becoming a courtesan, for Veronica, was not a fall. It was not a scandal. It was, in a sense, a choice, or at least, the least restricted choice a woman of her intellect and beauty could make in 16th century Venice, and in that choice she decided to shape her own reputation. Where many women were content or compelled to remain hidden, Veronica stepped into the light. She declared herself a courtesan. She published under her own name. She stood alongside male poets, debated them in verse, and signed her work not with initials, but with her full identity. I am she seemed to say, who does not hide. There was danger in that. Great danger. A woman who read was unusual. A woman who spoke was disruptive. A woman who published, who spoke, and made others listen was something many could not abide. But Veronica did not stop. She wrote poetry that touched on love, yes, but also on agency, on what it meant to be seen, what it meant to be bought, and yet to remain unnowned. She described the streets of Venice not with the haze of romance, but with clarity. The smell of wet stone, the feel of silk robes slipping down the stairs of a canal-side villa, the sound of a man's voice softening when he thought himself alone. She wrote not for pity, and not for rebellion, but for truth. The truth of being a woman with a voice in a world that preferred women silent. And in doing so, she began to change how the city saw her, not only as a courtesan, but as a citizen of thought. There are voices that rise like music in a hall, filling the room, drawing attention, and fading with applause. And then there are voices like smoke, quiet, persistent, laced with perfume and danger. Voices that linger long after the words themselves have faded. Veronica Franco's voice was like smoke. By her early 20s, she had mastered not only the graces expected of a courtegiana once to music, conversation, dress, but also something far more rare, the written word. In a city where women's voices were often heard only through gossip or rumor, Veronica made herself heard on the page, carefully, elegantly, publicly. She had begun her ascent among the Venetian elite not merely by being beautiful, or clever, or fashionable, but by being visible. And in 16th century Venice, where appearance was everything, to be both seen and heard was a subtle act of rebellion. Her poems, first exchanged in salons and handwritten letters, later published in volumes, brought her acclaim among literati and nobles alike. But not because she wrote of flowers or saints, as many women were expected to do. Veronica wrote about desire, betrayal, shame, and power. She wrote with intelligence sharpened by experience, with a tone that was both seductive and scathing. In her most famous collection, Ter's Rhyme, she uses the voice of the courtesan not to beg for affection, but to challenge her lovers, both real and literary. She writes, "If I am sin, then I am the mirror that shows the truth of what you seek." She cast herself not as a victim of men's whims, but as their reflection, their equal, their conscience. Her poetry often follows the form of the terza rima, a triplet structure pioneered by Dante, a structure difficult to master. It requires rhythm, restraint, and fluency. For Veronica, it was both a game and a sword. Her lines twist and turn with meaning. A reader must pay attention. Each phrase offers both an image and an invitation. And while her poems speak to passion and pleasure, they also contain a remarkable self-awareness. She does not plead for sympathy. She reveals the layers of her identity: woman, courtesan, poet, intellect with unflinching precision. She was not only documenting her world, but defining it. Beyond poetry, Veronica also wrote letters, one of the most respected and politically loaded forms of writing in her era. Her letter familiae diversi, familiar letters to various people, were epistolary essays written to real and imagined figures of power. In these letters, she did not beg, she reasoned, she persuaded, she demanded respect. To a Venetian nobleman, she wrote, "Do not think I am unworthy of reason because I live outside your walls. I have walked through halls you will never enter, not with your feet, but with your thoughts. These were not private diary entries. They were public statements, written with intention and layered with rhetorical craft. Veronica's writings circulated among a class of men who were not accustomed to being challenged by women in the language of scholarship. Her boldness was not vulgar, it was cultivated, controlled, and that made it all the more threatening to some. Still, she was protected, to a degree, by the patrons who found her dazzling. Chief among them was Domenico Venier, a Venetian nobleman and literary patron who hosted one of the most prominent salons in the city. His circle included poets, historians, philosophers, and occasionally high-ranking politicians. Under his mentorship, Veronica found not just support, but publication. She became a fixture in Venier's salon not as an ornament, but as a participant. Her presence there was unusual. Other women might serve as muses, models, or musically gifted entertainers. Veronica sat beside them. Yes, but with ink-stained fingers and an annotated volume of Ovid under her arm. She debated. She critiqued. She read her own verse aloud in a voice that was calm, steady, practiced. And yet, her position was never truly secure. No matter how refined her poetry, how precise her Latin, how graceful her entry into a room, she remained, in the eyes of Venetian society, a woman of the flesh, a courtesan. And that label, though legally permitted and socially tolerated, was never fully embraced by the polite world she moved in. Men admired her, but they also feared what she represented, a woman who had gained access to their world without marriage, without inheritance, and without their permission. For a time, she balanced this world like a gondola on the waterlight, gliding, always adjusting. She published more verse. She mentored younger courtesans. She advocated for education and reform. She even proposed a home for poor girls, where they might be raised with dignity and taught to read. It was a bold idea, one that she petitioned to the city council, but it never came to pass. Still, she kept writing. But time is a tide that does not stop. As her fame grew, so did resentment. Whispers followed her through the Kale, satirical pamphlets anonymous. Cruel mocked her as a woman too clever for her own good. Some critics said her poems were ghostwritten. Others dismissed her letters as vanity. A few praised her brilliance, but urged her to keep to her station. She responded not with scandal, but with stillness. She wrote a poem in which she imagined herself not as a courtesan, not as a woman, but as a mirror hung in a dark hallway reflecting the light of whoever passed by, but never recognized for its own shape. She knew that the same men who toasted her verses in private would never speak her name at court. And yet she remained. She remained in Venice, in her modest home along the canals, tending to her books, caring for her children, some legitimate, others not. She remained in her city of masks, choosing to remove hers only when the candlelight was just right. In those quiet hours, she wrote verses not for fame or fortune, but because they were hers. Even cities built on water can burn. Even empires built on silk and stone must, eventually, quiet. By the mid-1570s, Venice, that shimmering republic of gold-threaded masks and merchant glory, was beginning to fray. The palazzo still glowed with candlelight. The gondoliers still sang through the mist. But beneath the surface, cracks widened. Political instability stirred beneath polished diplomacy. Trade slowed. The Ottoman War strained coffers. And with the ships came something darker. The plague returned. It moved slowly at first, in whispers and rumors. There is illness in the port, some said. The cloth ships brought more than wool, others murmured. Then faster. An apprentice collapsed in the market. A magistrate's son took ill after a feast. A gondolier left his boat and never returned. By midsummer of 1575, the city began to shudder itself. Veronica Franco, now nearly 30, would have known immediately what was coming. She had lived through plagues before, smaller ones, short-lived. But this was different. The salons closed their doors. Literary circles vanished. The streets emptied. At first, people whispered. Then they screamed. The bells rang too often. Smoke from burned linens hung in the air like mourning. And Veronica, like so many others, retreated. The city imposed strict quarantine measures. Entire households were locked inside. Guards posted at doors. Food dropped through slits and shutters. The rich fled to the countryside. The poor stayed and suffered. Veronica did not leave. She stayed in Venice, in her modest home along the canals, with her children. Her income as a courtesan vanished overnight. There were no more patrons, no masked banquets, no letters of invitation, only silence, broken by the slow tolling of funeral bells echoing across the water. Over the next 2 years, the plague would claim tens of thousands of lives, nearly a third of Venice's population. The Republic built the Church of the Redeemer, Il Redentore, in honor of deliverance from the plague. It still stands today, its dome rising over the water in grateful defiance. But in the 1570s, the city was still waiting, still choking on ash and prayer. Veronica survived. Her children, we believe, did too. But survival did not mean recovery. When the plague ended in 1577, Venice re-emerged into a different world, a world more cautious, more bitter, less forgiving. Veronica's reputation had dimmed in her absence. Her literary peers had died or scattered. Her patrons were gone. The courtesan, once celebrated, had become inconvenient. Her verses no longer passed from hand to hand. The salons that had welcomed her now whispered behind her back. And then perhaps inevitably came accusation. In 1580, Veronica Franco was summoned before the Inquisition. Her crime was not clearly defined. There were whispers of witchcraft, of immorality, of unclean practices. Nothing specific, everything vague. The sort of charges designed not to reveal truth, but to silence. To understand what this meant, you must understand the climate of fear that followed plague. People needed someone to blame, and women like Veronica, educated, visible, unrepentant, were easy targets. She had written openly about her profession. She had spoken of God in poetic terms. She had dared to claim respect without renouncing her past. In Venice, the Inquisition did not often burn heretics, but it questioned them, pressured them, intimidated them. We have only fragments of what happened during Veronica's trial. It was not widely documented, perhaps because the charges were never made official, perhaps because the trial ended not in condemnation, but in silence. We know this: she was acquitted. No sentence was passed, no confession forced. She defended herself eloquently, with references to scripture and law. She reminded her accusers that she had never hidden her life, that her words were public, that she had lived honestly, even if not conventionally. But the damage had been done. Her reputation never recovered. She returned home to a city that had moved on. Her poetry remained in print, but no new works followed. The salons no longer opened their doors. The patrons who once praised her wit now kept their distance. She was not jailed, nor exiled. She was simply forgotten. In the years that followed, Veronica lived modestly. She cared for her children, at least 6, born over many years. Some were fathered by noblemen. Some may have died in infancy. Records are incomplete. Like so many women's stories, she never married again, nor did she return to her former profession. She lived in the shadows of the city she had once illuminated. And yet, she did not vanish. She lingered, like her verses, quiet but persistent. Her published works, though no longer fashionable, remained in circulation. Her letters were studied by a few curious scholars. Her name became a footnote, a whisper, a legend only half remembered. Veronica Franco died in 1591, at around 45 years old. There was no grand funeral, no poetic eulogies. Her grave, if marked, has been lost to time. Her children disappeared into the folds of Venetian society, but her words endured. Centuries later, her poetry was rediscovered. Feminist scholars in the 20th century read her verses with awe and recognition. They saw in her the struggles of modern women negotiating power, identity, autonomy. She became a symbol not only of Renaissance brilliance, but of survival. Today, her poems are studied in universities. Her name appears in literary anthologies. A film was made about her life. Her letters have been translated and analyzed. And in Venice, if you walk slowly near Campo San Polo in the early morning mist, you may pass a quiet canal where a girl once recited Virgil by candlelight, while her mother listened from the next room. Veronica Franco was never just a courtesan, never just a poet, never just a woman of Venice. She was all of those things woven into each other, like a braid of ink and smoke. She lived in a time that did not know what to do with her, but she lived on her terms. And when the world tried to silence her, she spoke anyway. She left behind not just words, but a rhythm that continues, softly, gently, waiting for you to hear it. There is a silence that lingers and ruins. It's not the silence of absence, it's the silence of memory, of voices once echoing between walls now roofless, of footsteps stilled mid-stride by ash. When archaeologists began excavating Pompeii in the 18th century, they didn't know they were also unearthing one of the most vivid glimpses into the ancient sex trade ever preserved. The city, buried beneath volcanic debris in 79 CE by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, frozen time, its villas, shops, taverns, and yes, its brothels, almost eerily intact. What they found behind some of the city's most unassuming doors would quietly change how we understand ancient daily life. In the heart of Pompeii lies the lupanar, its name derived from lupa, the Latin word for she-wolf, a common euphemism for prostitute. The lupanar was a compact, two-story building located just off a busy crossroads. From the outside, it might have looked like any other structure, plain, small, functional. But within its walls, something extraordinary had been preserved. The brothel had 10 small rooms, each with a masonry bed constructed of stone and later padded, likely, with thin mattresses or woven blankets. The rooms were cramped, windowless, and offered only the most basic privacy. Each cell had a curtain rather than a door, and above each doorway, painted into the wall in ochre and black, were small frescoes. These weren't decorations, they were advertisements. Each fresco showed a different sexual position or act executed in a surprisingly stylized and professional way, without explicit realism. Scholars believe they may have functioned as a menu of sorts, offering options to clients who may not have spoken the same language or been literate. Others suggest they were merely suggestive, designed to enhance the space's erotic ambience. But what is most striking is not their existence, it is their preservation. In the lupanar, and in similar Pompeian buildings, we find dozens of graffiti scratched into plaster walls by patrons, workers, and even passers-by. Some are boastful, "I spent 2 denarii, and it was worth every coin." Some are poetic, some are rude, but all of them speak to an unfiltered, human reality. And yet, despite the vividness of these remnants, the identities of the women who worked there remain largely unknown. Their names, if recorded, are aliases. Their faces, if painted, were stylized. Their voice. Amsterdam begins and ends with water. Its canals wind not just through the city, but through its past, reflecting facades of gabled houses, tilted with time, and doors worn smooth by centuries of hands. The light here, even now, has a weight to it, a northern softness, cloud-muted, glass-filtered, and in the stillness of a cold dawn or a quiet dusk, one might almost hear the echo of a bell chiming across the cobblestones, or the creak of a wooden shutter slowly opening. It is in these quiet gestures and shutters, in curtains, in signs no bigger than a loaf of bread, that the archaeology of Amsterdam's brothels speaks. Unlike Pompeii's dramatic, ash-preserved lupanar, the brothels of early modern Amsterdam left more subtle traces. They were not encased in stone, nor buried by fire. Instead, they survived as shapes in floor plans, as notations in civic registers, and as architectural footprints that blend, almost imperceptibly, into the rows of merchant homes and taverns that line the canals. Let us begin on a narrow street, perhaps out as each Achterbergwal, in what is now the modern red light district, but in the 1600s was simply a bustling, chaotic neighborhood of sailors, servants, bookbinders, and spice merchants. You pass rows of homes, their windows tall and slender, the buildings no more than 3 or 4 stories high, their facades leaning gently forward like listeners. In between them, you see signs, but not just any signs. Die Goud Dildo, Het, Rude Lampkin, Die Drie Hofisens. These were not names chosen idly. In the 17th century, it was common practice to mark a business not with numbers, those were not yet used for addresses, but with illustrative signage. A painted image would hang above the door, a red lantern, a crowned swan, or 3 small horseshoes. These signs were not only for direction, they were coded invitations. A red light did not yet mean what it does today, but it hinted. A crown above a bed, a subtle nod to royal treatment. A cat in a window, perhaps a reference to sly company or a home kept warm at night. Some brothels operated openly, with the quiet protection of local guilds and civic leaders. Others remained semi-clandestine, shifting their appearances like tide-washed sandbars visible at low tide, gone at high. Architecture helped with this invisibility. Many brothels were built inside what we now call double-depth houses, long, narrow structures with rooms stretching from front to back, often ending in a small courtyard. The front room might be a tavern or waiting area, beyond a hallway or behind a curtain. A second room, dimly lit and richly upholstered, served another purpose. Staircases were steep and narrow, forcing those who ascended them to slow their pace, to bow slightly, an architectural cue of submission, or at least of silence. Windows facing the street were tightly shuttered, not necessarily for secrecy, but to control the presentation of light and shadow. In a world without electric bulbs, illumination itself was a kind of stagecraft. Some houses had small peepholes carved into shutters, round, coin-sized openings through which a woman could watch the street, not always to advertise, sometimes just to see, to be seen. And beneath the floorboards, yes, Literally hidden compartments were sometimes built. These served many functions: storage for jewelry, ledgers, in some cases, contraceptives or small herbs used in reproductive care. Rarely did these items survive the centuries intact, but the hollow spaces remain. When architects renovate buildings along the canal today, they often find such voids unmarked, undocumented, unexplained. In the 1600s, the city of Amsterdam did not fully criminalize prostitution. Instead, it took the more pragmatic Dutch approach: regulate, tolerate, tax. Civic records show fines levied not for prostitution itself, but for violations of curfew, noise disturbances, or operating outside approved areas. In some periods, women had to register with city clerks. In others, they were simply known to local constables, who visited occasionally, collected dues, and left. Brothels were required to maintain clean sheets. Proper. If you listen carefully beneath the noise of the centuries, beneath the pages of law books and the sermons and the silence, you'll hear something softer. A rustle, a creak, the quiet shifting of things that were never meant to last, but somehow did, because long after the women are gone, and the houses are boarded shut, and the names are forgotten, something remains, not in museums, usually, not in grand archives or palaces, but beneath floorboards, in a fragment of cloth, a shard of painted ceramic, a worn step in a narrow hallway, bowed by generations of quiet feet. In cities across Europe, Paris, London, Lyon, Lisbon, even Stockholm, archaeologists have uncovered the faint, physical echoes of brothels. These aren't Pompeii's stone rooms or Amsterdam's canal signs. They are traces of lived space, objects too mundane to document in records, too intimate to name. Take, for example, a dig in Southwark, on the south bank of the River Thames in London, once a working-class district known for taverns, bear-baiting, and theatres, Shakespeare's Globe among them. Southwark was also home to the infamous stew houses, the medieval English word for licensed bathhouses, many of which also functioned as brothels. In the remains of one such stew, archaeologists found layers of ash and brick, but also something stranger: a small copper token, no larger than a coin. On one side, a number, 3, on the other, a crude image, possibly a reclining figure. These tokens, historians believe, were issued by brothel owners in exchange for services, a kind of prepaid system. They could be lost, stolen, or traded like currency. But in this case, the token had slipped between two floorboards, vanished from view for over 400 years. It's easy to imagine the scene. A man, perhaps drunk, fumbles in his coat. The token falls. The woman laughs softly, waves him upstairs. He does not notice, and the token rests there, quietly, as London rises and falls above it. In another excavation nearby, archaeologists uncovered a lead disc, punched with a small hole, possibly an amulet, possibly worn for protection or fertility. Nearby, a child's shoe, a cracked ceramic cup, 3 pens, and a comb. No record tells us whose these were. No diary describes their owner, but the objects whisper: someone was here, someone who lived and worked and waited, someone who combed her hair and removed her shoes and left behind a trace. She never meant to. In Paris, the story is similar, though the documentation is richer. By the 18th century, the French capital had entire streets unofficially designated for maisons closes, closed houses. Official brothels had shuttered windows and numbered entrances, and their layouts followed familiar patterns: narrow hallways, corner sinks, service bells. In a building renovation in the Marais district, workers discovered an attic room painted entirely red, with inscriptions in charcoal on the walls. Names, prices, a poem, a date, 1762. There was no furniture left, but a dent in the floor indicated a bed frame once stood there, and beneath the floorboards, a box of hairpins, a broken scent bottle, and a single dried rose wrapped in lace. Historians can only speculate. Perhaps it was a gift, or a memento, or something left behind in haste, but it is something that survived the revolution, the fires, the centuries. Other finds are even more unexpected. In Lyon, a cellar once used as storage revealed layers of plaster wall carving, symbols, initials, small hearts pierced by arrows. Some dated back to the 1600s, others to the late 1800s. Over centuries, the space had been reused as a wine cellar, a shelter, and possibly a discreet rendezvous house. The marks etched by fingernail or knife were anonymous, but familiar. In Seville, Spain, beneath a convent-turned school, remains of an earlier house were found, painted tiles depicting a woman, holding a lute, a shallow basin with rosewater residue, and a narrow chamber with a hidden latch behind a fresco of St. Catherine. Not all brothels were marked openly. Many were embedded into the structure of larger homes hidden among guest quarters, or cloaked in entertainment rooms. Especially in cities like Vienna or Prague, wealthier clients sought discretion, and the architecture obliged. Archaeologists often identify brothel spaces by a combination of clues, unusually small, or repeating rooms on upper floors, often with thin partitions, staircases with dual entry points, one for clients, one for workers, wall hooks placed at shoulder height for curtains, now long gone, an unusual density of personal objects, combs, pins, mirrors, scent bottles, buttons, shoe buckles, too many for a single family household. But more than architecture, it is the pattern of objects that tells the story. Not just one perfume bottle, but a dozen. Not just one comb, but 3, each carved differently. Not just a piece of lace, but lace pressed beneath a floor joist, as if accidentally stepped on and never retrieved. These details may seem small, but for those seeking to understand how people actually lived, especially people left out of formal history, they are everything. They reveal a quiet labor, an economy of gesture, a choreography of survival. And perhaps most profoundly, they remind us that these were not imagined spaces, not metaphors, not moral lessons. These were real rooms, real windows, real stairs, real hands opening real doors, and in them, people who lived in the margins of their society carved out a rhythm, a way of being, a fragile kind of control. Today, when modern archaeologists uncover, imagine, for a moment, a night in Renaissance Florence. Candles flicker behind carved wooden shutters. The streets echo faintly with lute music and soft laughter drifting from behind velvet draped balconies. Through the narrow alleyways, cloaked figures move without fanfare, footsteps softened by worn stone. Not common merchants or travelers, but men in fine gloves and polished boots, noblemen, ambassadors, sons of dukes. They are not headed to a palace, nor to prayer. They are headed to the brothel, across Europe, from Florence to Paris to Krakow. Brothels did not exist only on the peripheries of society. In many cities, especially in the Renaissance and early modern periods, they were entangled with power, serving not just as places of pleasure, but as political instruments, social hubs, and sites of controlled indulgence. To walk through the doors of a luxury brothel as a nobleman was not seen as scandalous. It was expected, almost a rite of passage. These brothels, unlike the modest red houses of the working poor, catered to elite clientele. They were often housed in elegant buildings, sometimes owned outright by nobles or church officials, and featured elaborate decor, silk hangings, imported carpets, polished wood furniture, and food and wine of the same quality served in courts. The women who worked in these houses were not uneducated or powerless. Many were trained in poetry, music, multiple languages. They were more than entertainers, they were conversation partners, educated to navigate flirtation, politics, and subtle diplomacy. This is the world in which Veronica Franco, whom we met earlier, thrived. But she was not alone. In Paris, the courtesan was a known, if unofficial, figure. In Venice, nobles would hold private suppers in brothels, inviting musicians and courtesans to drink and dance. In early Tudor England, the stews of Southwark attracted everyone from local aldermen to foreign dignitaries. Records show that Henry VIII's court officials frequented them openly. Henry himself, long before his marriages became a matter of state drama, was said to keep company with women who lived in licensed houses of comfort. These houses were also places of information exchange. Nobles, politicians, and high-ranking clergy spoke freely in brothels in ways they could not at court. The women who worked there heard these conversations. Some kept what they knew private, others used it. Some became informants, some became scapegoats. It was understood what happened behind the curtains could shape what happened in Parliament. And there was another level still. In certain cases, nobles and even kings used brothels not merely for pleasure, but for control. In France, during the reign of Louis XV, there existed a notorious chateau known as the Parc aux Cerfs, the Deer Park. Hidden from public view, it was essentially a royally maintained private brothel, where young women sometimes as young as 14 were brought in and housed, often without family knowledge, to serve the king's pleasure. It was not called a brothel publicly. It was said to be a place of study, of education. The euphemisms were endless. Here, the boundaries between consent, custom, and coercion blurred almost entirely. Though some women were compensated well, others were discarded with little regard. Power was absolute. The institution, though shrouded in secrecy, was no anomaly. It was a manifestation of how brothels could be woven directly into the fabric of statecraft. In the 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire took a different approach. Brothels near military garrisons were often established by decree. Officers were permitted, even encouraged, to frequent them. It was considered a form of discipline management, a relief valve for aggression. The women were paid, but also subject to regular inspections, registries, and often military supervision. To the nobles and kings who built and visited these spaces, brothels were not only about indulgence, they were about power and access to bodies, yes, but also access to intimacy without responsibility, to speech without consequence, to performance without witness. And this shaped not only the lives of the women involved but the politics of the courts, the whispers in the antechambers, the alliances formed over wine and silk sheets. And yet, few of these transactions were recorded. What we know comes not from confessions, but from fragments: a noble's expense ledger noting gifts for discretion, a servant's journal recording a regular carriage route that stopped behind the perfumers, a tapestry, decades faded, depicting Venus not in a mythic grove but lounging on a recognizable Parisian chaise. These are the Veradcrumbs. From them, we reconstruct a world that hummed beneath the pageantry of nobility, a world where velvet cloaks moved through quiet doors, and power met pleasure beneath soft candlelight. In every European city where brothels once thrived, you could usually find something else not far away, often just across the street, sometimes directly next door, a church. Its bells tolling the hour, its windows glowing with candlelight, its doors open to the weary, the repentant, the devout, and behind those walls prayers whispered for salvation, sermons spoken against sin, incense curling up toward painted ceilings. And yet, just beyond those walls, the curtains were being drawn. In red rooms, coins were exchanged, wine poured, lives unfolded in ways rarely acknowledged by the sermons echoing just beyond the alley. This proximity was not coincidence. It was design, because the church, not just individual clergy, but the institutional church, has always had a complicated relationship with brothels, one built on denunciation, yes, but also on toleration, regulation, even, in some cases, ownership. To understand this paradox, we must first go back centuries, back to medieval Europe, where the theology of sin and the administration of cities often moved hand in hand. By the 12th and 13th centuries, prostitution was recognized as inevitable, if not openly accepted. Saint Augustine himself had argued centuries earlier that without it, lusts would overthrow society. Better, he reasoned, to contain such impulses than to drive them into chaos. So cities, especially cathedral towns like Avignon, Toledo, and Trier, began to create zones for the sex trade, areas where brothels could operate with regulation, under watchful eyes. The church often supported these arrangements indirectly through moral logic, through political alignment, and sometimes through financial investment. In many towns, it was the bishop or abbot who approved charters for these districts. In some cases, monastic lands were leased to brothel owners. The money, of course, was used for the upkeep of churches, a transaction clean on paper, if not in conscience. Even the Vatican, in its temporal dealings, was not always untouched. In the 15th century, Pope Sixtus IV, yes, the same pope who commissioned the Sistine Chapel, taxed brothels in Rome. The funds, historians believe, were used to help rebuild infrastructure and even pay for certain public health initiatives. It was a system of moral containment. Better, church leaders believed, to know where sin was happening and to whom it was happening, than to pretend it did not exist. But the contradictions ran deep. In city records, we find lists of fines levied against immodest women, often for wearing bright fabrics, walking unescorted, or being seen laughing too loudly. And yet, these same women were subject to mandatory tithes, contributions to the church taken from their earnings. Confessors were assigned to brothels. Priests offered absolution in exchange for penance, though the penance often varied by class. A noble woman who visited a brothel might be required to donate to a convent. A sex worker might be told to fast for weeks. But it was not just theology that shaped the church's role, it was presence. In many cities, churches stood at the very heart of red light districts. In Cologne, for example, the Magdalena quarter, named for the biblical figure most often miscast as a repentant prostitute, was home to both nuns and sex workers. The Magdalene houses that sprang up across Europe were designed as asylums, places of reform for women leaving the trade. Some offered shelter, others enforced silence and labor. The line between rescue and imprisonment was often thin. Inside these institutions, women slept in shared cells, recited prayers at dawn, and wove cloth or copied manuscripts for hours. Some found peace, others found only another kind of confinement, and yet, the Church's proximity to these lives gave it powerful access. Priests and monks often served as confessors, spiritual guides, or more troublingly as clients. Records from 14th century England describe several clerics fined for frequenting brothels. In the name of inquiry, in Florence, bishops issued written complaints against houses that served wine, but did not restrict clergy access. In private, many clergymen confessed to internal struggle. Letters survive, some shaky with ink, others composed in careful Latin, in which monks and friars lament their weakness, their return to sinful houses, and their desire to do penance. But these same men were often protected by the structure that condemned others. The paradox deepened with the rise of Reformation Europe, as Protestant cities like Geneva and Zurich cracked down on prostitution with zealous fervor. Catholic strongholds like Rome and Naples adopted more administrative approaches, preferring fines and health checks over public trials. In this time, some brothels began to adopt the appearance of religious decor, perhaps in irony, perhaps in hope. One account from 17th century Madrid describes a room wallpapered with faded devotional prints and a crucifix. A power has a weight, not the visible kind, not a crown, or a robe, or a sword, but a quieter burden, one that presses behind the eyes, curls beneath the ribcage, walks behind you like a second shadow. For the nobles, kings, bishops, and princes of Europe's grand palaces, life was not always a glittering feast. Yes, there was wine. Yes, there was silk and ceremony. But there were also rules, expectations, watchful eyes at every corridor. The court was a stage, a gilded one, but a stage nonetheless. Every gesture mattered. Every word could be recorded, twisted, remembered. Marriages were not unions of love but treaties. Friendships were rarely without purpose, and emotions, tenderness, longing, boredom had no official outlet. But just beyond the court, in unmarked buildings, behind painted doors, there were rooms of escape. And that is what many brothels became, not just places of pleasure or transaction, but quiet chambers where powerful men could stop performing, if only for a few hours. These elite brothels, sometimes called salons de repos, were not gaudy. They were tastefully designed, often resembling the salons of noble women or the music rooms of minor royals. There were couches, candles, instruments in the corner, a servant who knew how to pour without asking questions. The women who worked in these houses, many of them former courtesans, artists, or actresses, were chosen not only for their beauty, but for their discretion and emotional intelligence. Some were trained to soothe, to converse gently, to listen, to say what a duchess would never say, and to hear what a prince would never admit in the drawing room. A man who could not speak of his sadness at court might weep silently in a red room. A bishop burdened with guilt might whisper stories of his childhood by firelight. A king, weary from the weight of rule, might ask not to be touched, but simply to rest fully clothed beside someone who would not record it. And in these rooms, beneath the surface of society, human complexity unfolded. Of course, not all brothels were havens. Many were cruel, transactional, harshly run. But in these elite establishments, especially in cities like Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, brothels became something else, spaces without consequence. And that was their true luxury, because in the palaces, every act had consequence. An affair could start a war, a wrong word could lose a fortune, a tear in public could destroy a reputation. But in these quieter rooms, a man could lose control without losing face. He could love foolishly, speak openly, be weak. Some of the most powerful rulers in Europe were known to frequent these spaces not with arrogance, but with yearning. Louis XIV, despite his many public mistresses, kept a quiet residence near Versailles where lower-ranked courtesans entertained not with performance, but with peace. Frederick the Great of Prussia, known for his austere manner and rigid court, was rumored to keep the company of philosophers and musicians in a modest brothel outside Berlin, where debates lasted deep into the night. In Russia, during the reign of Catherine the Great, certain houses were registered under the Empress's own court registry, not because she personally visited them, but because she recognized their role in maintaining order among her restless nobles. Even popes, monarchs, and emperors so carefully sculpted in oil and marble, left behind letters and journals that hint at these quiet visits. Not always sordid, sometimes simply human. A letter from a Spanish nobleman in the 1600s reads, "Last night I found my soul again, not in the chapel, but in that small house beyond the canal, where the girl sang me to sleep with a tune I knew as a boy." What does that mean? It means that even in the most carefully controlled societies, there was a need for release, not just sexual but emotional, spiritual, existential. Brothels, in this light, become more than institutions. They become mirrors, reflecting not just society's desires, but its anxieties, its loneliness, its fear of being seen without armor. The women who worked in them were not merely providers. They were witnesses to power at rest, to vulnerability in secret, to the full spectrum of the human experience: tenderness, cruelty, silence, longing. And while their names often went unrecorded, their labor, the emotional, psychological, and physical labor they performed, shaped the lives of the very people who shaped history. Their rooms, now vanished or repurposed, once held moments that mattered, not on the battlefield, not at the throne, but in the private, unscripted theater of confession and touch. So when we speak of palaces and power, we must also speak of those quiet doors behind the palace, where the candlelight burned lower, and where a king might finally speak freely to someone who would never tell. You've traveled far tonight, through ash-covered stones in ancient Pompeii, through shuttered alleyways in Amsterdam, past frescoes, tokens, combs, and whispered names scratched into plaster. You've stood beside a girl from the countryside, peering nervously into the flickering lamplight of her first night's work. You've watched Veronica Franco write verses between appointments, verses that still echo through time, reminding us that intellect and vulnerability have always shared a room. You've brushed past velvet curtains in noble brothels, seen how kings sought comfort not in coronations, but in the quiet presence of someone who asked for nothing, not even their name. And you've seen the church stone, unwavering, try to reconcile its need for virtue with the very human lives happening just outside its sanctuaries. In each place, you've found layers of silence, of survival, of softness beneath the weight of judgment. Because history, especially the kind we do not often speak of, is never just fact. It is texture, it is smell, and light, and wood worn smooth by the same hands, night after night. And in the stories of brothels, the stories that history once tried to erase, we find truths, not about scandal, but about intimacy, power, need, and, most importantly, resilience. The women who lived these lives were not one thing. They were musicians, healers, listeners, survivors. They existed in the gaps of official records, but shaped the rhythm of everyday life in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. Their rooms were not grand, but they were spaces of transformation for their visitors, and for themselves. They navigated worlds where reputation was fragile, safety uncertain, and tenderness both a commodity and a risk. And still, they endured, some with wit, some with poetry, some with quiet strength. Tonight, as the candlelight of the past dims gently in your mind, know that this journey was not only historical, it was human. You have walked through the forgotten wings of cities. You have heard the hush of voices behind walls. You have seen the soft side of survival where people carved dignity into rooms no one was meant to remember. And now, as the rhythm of the day slows, as your breath evens, as sleep gently gathers at the edge of your thoughts, allow yourself to rest. The stories are still here. The stones still whisper. The shutters still creak softly in the wind. But for now, the houses are quiet, the candles extinguished, the door gently closed. Good night, and may your sleep be peaceful as the past gently fades away.